I am Simone, 32 years old, and tonight I watched my father pack my belongings into black trash bags. My sister demanded to know who would pay for her luxury car now that I had lost my job, and my mother told me to make a sacrifice for the family. I said absolutely nothing. I just handed over the keys and walked out into the night. They thought they were throwing a bankrupt failure out on the street. They had no idea. They had just evicted the sole financial guarantor of their entire fake reality, or that within hours, I would be watching the ocean from my private estate. Before I share exactly how their perfect facade crumbled into dust, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. The heavy mahogany front door of my childhood home in Atlanta clicked shut behind me. I had just spent the last 4 hours clearing out my corporate desk after a brutal wave of layoffs hit my marketing firm. My shoulders ached and my mind was racing with the logistics of severance packages and healthcare benefits. I dropped my keys into the crystal bowl on the entryway table, expecting the usual quiet of a Tuesday evening in our upscale neighborhood. Instead, I found my father Calvin standing right in the middle of the grand foyer. He was aggressively shoving my winter coats and designer shoes into cheap black garbage bags. I did not even look up when my heels echoed against the marble floor. He just kept tossing my property into the plastic bags, his jaw set in that familiar rigid line of disapproval that I had grown up fearing. I stood there clutching my cardboard box of office supplies, trying to process the surreal scene playing out in front of me. "Dad," I asked, my voice tight with exhaustion. "What exactly are you doing with my things?" Calvin finally paused, wiping a speck of dust from his perfectly tailored slacks. He looked at me not with a fatherly sense of concern, but with the cold calculation of a landlord who had just found a better-paying tenant. "Jada and Brad have reached the end of their lease at that apartment complex," he said flatly, his voice devoid of any emotion. "They need this space. You just lost your job anyway, and you are 32 with no husband in sight. You do not need the master suite anymore. You can figure it out. Find a small place somewhere else." Before I could even process the absolute cruelty of his words, the sharp clacking of heels announced the arrival of my younger sister. Jada strutted into the hallway, wearing a silk robe that I had bought for her last birthday. There was zero sympathy on her beautiful, meticulously contoured face. There was only a mask of frantic, self-centered panic. She completely ignored the heavy box in my hands and the exhausted slump of my shoulders. "Who is going to pay the lease on my Tesla now?" Jada screamed, her voice shrill and demanding as she pointed an acrylic fingernail at my chest. "You promised to cover it this month. You cannot just lose your job right when Brad is about to launch his new application. We have image standards to maintain in this community. We cannot be seen driving regular cars." My mother Renee glided out of the formal dining room right behind her. She placed a comforting hand on Jada's shoulder, shooting me a glare that felt like physical poison. "Your sister has a husband and a social standing to protect in this city, Simone." Renee scolded me as if I were a misbehaving child who had just broken a valuable vase. "Brad is on the verge of a massive technological breakthrough. He needs a stable environment to work. You are alone. You have no one depending on you and no image to uphold. For once in your life, put your jealousy aside and make a sacrifice for this family." I stared at the three of them in total disbelief. My father was tying a tight knot on a garbage bag filled with my expensive clothes. My sister was throwing a childish tantrum over a luxury car she could not afford to put gas in. My mother was demanding I sacrifice my housing and stability to fund an absolute mirage. Through the rapid-fire assault of their entitlement, a bitter realization settled deep in my chest. They actually believed I was useless now that my corporate paycheck had stopped arriving. They had happily drained my bank accounts for years, allowing me to fund their country club dinners, Brad's endless string of failed business ventures, and Jada's pageant queen lifestyle. And the very minute they thought my well of money had run dry, they decided to throw me out like actual garbage. Heavy footsteps echoed on the staircase above us. Brad descended slowly, a smug grin plastered across his pale face. He was swirling a glass of my most expensive imported red wine, the bottle I had been saving for a very special occasion. He leaned against the polished wooden banister, looking down at me with unbearable arrogance. Come on, Simone, Brad chuckled, taking a slow sip of my wine. Do not be dramatic about this. We just need the space for my home office. You can easily rent a studio downtown. Maybe get a roommate to split the costs. It builds character. A white man who had not held a steady job in 5 long years was telling me to build character while standing in the house. I paid for drinking the wine I bought with my hard-earned money. The blatant disrespect was almost poetic in its sheer absurdity. My parents nodded along with him, looking at Brad like he was a financial genius, offering profound wisdom to a struggling peasant. They worshipped the ground he walked on, simply because he fit their aesthetic ideal of a successful son-in-law, even though his pockets were completely empty. In the past, the old Simone would have cried. I would have dropped my box and begged them to understand my stress. I would have argued that I had given them everything I had, that I had delayed my own life goals, to make sure they never lost their elite status among their friends. I would have pleaded for just a few weeks to find a new job and get back on my feet. But the woman standing in that foyer was no longer the desperate daughter seeking their impossible validation. I felt an icy, powerful calm wash over my entire body. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I did not try to explain myself to people who were committed to misunderstanding my value. I slowly reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the spare key fob for Jada's luxury car. I held it up for a brief moment, making sure she saw it, and then I simply tossed it onto the marble floor. It landed with a sharp clatter that echoed through the quiet house, making my mother flinch backward. Then I set down my office box, picked up my purse, and grabbed the only small suitcase of mine that my father had not yet thrown into a trash bag. "Where do you think you are going?" my mother demanded, her voice wavering slightly at my unnatural, terrifying silence. "You are not leaving this house until we discuss how you are going to transfer the remaining balance for the car payment. We have bills to pay, Simone." I looked right through her. I looked at Calvin, who suddenly seemed uneasy under my steady gaze. I looked at Jada, whose mouth was hanging open in pure shock. And finally, I looked at Brad, raising a single eyebrow at his stolen glass of wine. "Enjoy the house," I said. My voice was dangerously quiet, lacking any trace of the fear or desperation they wanted to see. I turned around, opened the heavy front door, and walked out into the cool Atlanta evening. I did not look back. I did not tell them the one crucial piece of information that would have sent them falling to their knees in absolute terror. They thought they owned that massive house. They thought Calvin and Renee's names on the deed meant they held all the power and authority. They completely forgot, or conveniently ignored, that I was the sole financial guarantor of the mortgage. Without my monthly direct deposits covering the massive debt they had accumulated, the bank would take that house away from them before the season ended. I had been paying for the roof over their heads for 4 long years. And I had just decided to permanently close my wallet and let them face the consequences of their own actions. I ordered a premium ride share from the corner of the street, instructing the driver to take me directly to the private terminal of the international airport. I leaned my head against the cool leather window of the car, letting out a long, slow breath of pure relief. My corporate marketing job had just been a cover story all along. A simple way to appease my status-obsessed parents while I built my real life in total secrecy. As the car sped down the highway toward the airport, my phone buzzed in the palm of my hand. The screen illuminated the dark back seat of the car. It was an automated alert from my private wealth management firm. Wire transfer successful. $4.5 million from the corporate acquisition has been deposited into your primary holding account. I smiled, feeling a profound sense of victory wash over me. I was the anonymous founder of a massive cybersecurity firm that had just been bought out by a global tech conglomerate. The layoff from my day job earlier that afternoon was actually my own choice. A planned exit to step into my new billionaire reality without arousing any suspicion from my greedy family. I opened my travel application and booked a first-class one-way ticket to Massachusetts. It was finally time to go home. Not to the toxic trap in Atlanta, but to the breathtaking multi-million-dollar historic beachfront estate I secretly owned in Oak Bluffs on Martha's Vineyard. It was the ultimate sanctuary I had bought for myself in the most prestigious neighborhood possible. As the plane lifted off the runway, leaving my clueless parasitic family far below in the dark, I knew the real game had just begun. Their impending financial ruin was going to be the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed, and I was going to watch every single second of their downfall from the comfort of my oceanfront balcony. The crisp morning air of Massachusetts was a sharp contrast to the suffocating humidity I had left behind in Atlanta. When my private car pulled up to the wrought iron gates of my estate in Oak Bluffs, a profound sense of peace washed over me. This was Martha's Vineyard, the historic summer haven for the African American elite, and I owned one of its crown jewels. The three-story beachfront mansion with its classic cedar shingles and wraparound porches stood as a silent testament to the empire I had built entirely in the shadows. I walked through the massive front doors, dropping my single suitcase onto the reclaimed wood floor. There was no screaming sister here. There was no condescending father packing my belongings into garbage bags. There was only the sound of waves crashing against my private stretch of beach and the undeniable reality of my own power. I walked straight into my home office, a beautiful room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. I sat behind my desk, opened my laptop, and dialed the direct line to my private wealth manager. He answered on the second ring. I told him it was time to execute the financial separation protocol we had discussed. My voice was completely steady, as I gave the instructions that would systematically dismantle my family's illusion of wealth. I told him to terminate the credit line attached to my brother-in-law's failing company. I instructed him to freeze the account that automatically paid for my sister's luxury car lease. I sat there and listened as he confirmed each cancellation one by one. With a few simple strokes on a keyboard, the financial life support I had been providing for 4 exhausting years was permanently disconnected. I closed my laptop, walked out to my balcony, and let the ocean breeze clear my mind. It took exactly 3 days for the illusion to shatter. I was sitting on my patio, enjoying a quiet breakfast when my phone screen lit up with a barrage of notifications. The family group chat was exploding. Dozens of messages poured in, each one more frantic and hostile than the last. Before I could even read the first text, my phone vibrated in my hand with an incoming call from Brad. I let it ring twice before I calmly swiped to answer. "Simone, what the hell is going on with the corporate card?" Brad shouted into the receiver. His voice was breathless with panic, and I could hear the muffled background noise of a busy upscale restaurant. "I am sitting here at a business lunch with 2 potential investors, and the waiter just told me my card was declined. It was declined for insufficient funds, Simone. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich flavor. "I imagine it is quite humiliating, Brad. But since you are the brilliant startup founder in the family, I am sure you can figure out a way to pay for your own lunch." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Are you crazy?" Brad hissed, dropping his voice to a frantic whisper so his guests would not hear him. "We had a deal. You know my company is going through a transitional phase. You cannot just cut off my funding without warning. You need to call your bank and fix this right now. If you have to cash out your retirement fund, cash out your 401k. Family helps family, Simone. You owe us that much after the way you disrespected your parents the other night." The sheer audacity of his demand was staggering. A white man who had never earned a single dime of his own wealth, who lived rent-free in a house I paid for, was standing in a 5-star restaurant, demanding that a black woman empty her retirement savings to fund his delusional lifestyle. He actually believed he was entitled to the very last drop of my financial stability. I did not argue with him. I did not explain that I had no retirement fund to cash out because I had just deposited $4.5 million into a holding account. I simply laughed. A cold, clear, genuine laugh that echoed across my quiet balcony. And then, without saying another word, I ended the call. Less than 30 seconds later, my phone rang again. This time it was my father. I answered, keeping the phone away from my ear as his booming voice filled the space. "Who do you think you are?" Calvin roared. "You disappear in the middle of the night, you turn off the family accounts out of pure spite, and you embarrass your brother-in-law in front of crucial investors. Have you lost your mind?" "I have found my self-respect, Dad," I replied evenly. "Something I should have done years ago." Do not use that disrespectful tone with me, he snapped. You are acting like a spoiled, vindictive child because you are upset about losing your marketing job. Well, I have found a solution for your little unemployment problem. I just called my friend Richard over at his law firm. He is willing to give you a job as a front desk receptionist starting on Monday. The pay is minimum wage, but you are going to take it. You are going to take that job, and you are going to send every single paycheck directly to Jada until Brad gets his company back on track. It is the least you can do to make up for this selfish stunt you are pulling. I was dead serious. He genuinely expected me to sit behind a reception desk answering phones for minimum wage, just so I could hand over my meager earnings to keep my sister draped in designer clothes. The depth of their sickness was almost fascinating to witness. They viewed me as nothing more than a beast of burden, an endless resource existing solely to make their lives easier. I will not be taking that job, Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper, and I will not be sending Jada another dime for as long as I live. You kicked me out because you thought I had nothing left to give. You made your choice. Now you get to live with it. I hung up the phone before he could scream another command. I went into my settings and permanently blocked Calvin, Renee, Jada, and Brad. I deleted the family group chat. I severed the digital cord just as cleanly as I had severed the financial one. But I knew my family. I knew they would not accept defeat quietly. They needed a narrative that protected their precious image in the Atlanta community. They needed a way to explain why their eldest daughter was suddenly gone and why they were suddenly struggling to pay for their lavish lifestyle. By that afternoon, the smear campaign had officially begun. I was sitting in my home office when my college roommate texted me a screenshot of a public post my mother had just made on her social media page. It was a long, dramatic, meticulously crafted lie designed to garner maximum sympathy from her country club friends and church congregation. It is with a heavy heart that Calvin and I must share some painful family news, the post began. Our eldest daughter Simone has been struggling with severe mental instability and depression following the loss of her job. We tried everything to help her, but she has chosen a path of vindictive and erratic behavior, lashing out at her sister and her brother-in-law. It breaks our hearts, but to protect the peace and safety of our family, we have had to make the agonizing decision to distance ourselves. For this reason, Simone will not be joining us for our 35th anniversary gala next week. Please keep her in your prayers as she battles her demons. I read the words twice, marveling at her ability to twist reality into such a convenient, self-serving fiction. She was banning me from a party I had no intention of attending, playing the heartbroken mother while actively trying to destroy my personal and professional reputation. She was preparing the ground to play the victim when the foreclosure notices eventually became public knowledge. She thought she had outsmarted me. She thought she had won the social war before I even had a chance to fight back. I carried my phone out to the balcony, leaning against the railing as I looked out at the rolling waves of the Atlantic. The sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant golden light across the water. I was not angry about the post. In fact, I found it incredibly useful. My mother had just publicly declared war, which meant I no longer had to hold back. My phone rang again. It was a private number, but I knew exactly who it was. I answered the call, my eyes fixed on the horizon. Simone, my lead acquisition lawyer, said, his voice brisk and professional. I am calling to confirm that the paperwork has been successfully processed. The holding company just finalized the purchase of the debt portfolio. I took a slow breath, letting the magnitude of the moment sink in. And the specific property we discussed, I asked. Yes, he confirmed. The portfolio included the distressed assets of the Atlanta Heritage Country Club. You are now the primary debt holder of the entire establishment. You effectively own the venue. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. The Atlanta Heritage Country Club was the exact venue where my parents were hosting their extravagant 35th anniversary gala the following weekend. It was the crown jewel of their social calendar, the place where they planned to parade around in front of the entire city, showing off their fake wealth and accepting pity for their supposedly unstable daughter. They had banned me from their party, completely unaware that I had just bought the building right out from under them. Thank you, I told my lawyer, my voice perfectly calm. Please inform the general manager of the club that the new owner will be attending the anniversary gala next Saturday, and tell him I expect a very prominent seat. I ended the call and slipped the phone into my pocket. My mother wanted a public spectacle. My father wanted to pack my life into garbage bags. My sister and her husband wanted to leech off my success while demanding I sacrifice my future for their comfort. They had demanded a sacrifice, and I was going to give them one. I was going to sacrifice their entire reputation, their financial security, and their carefully constructed lies on the altar of the truth. And I was going to do it in front of every single person they cared about trying to impress. The real game had just begun, and they did not even know the rules. Back in Atlanta, my family wasted zero time claiming the spoils of their perceived victory. From the quiet sanctuary of my oceanfront estate, I watched the illusion of their grandeur unfold in real time. Jada had always been obsessed with projecting a flawless image to the elite circles of our community, and she took to social media to broadcast her new reality. I sat on my plush linen sofa drinking a glass of sparkling water while her live video stream played on my tablet. She was walking through the grand hallways of the house. I was still secretly paying, holding a glass of expensive champagne. She turned the camera to show off my former bedroom. The walls had already been repainted a stark, sterile white. My custom bookshelves and heavy oak desk were completely gone, replaced by cheap modern furniture that looked like it belonged in a heavily filtered catalog. "Welcome to our new executive suite," Jada squealed to her viewers, flipping her long hair over her shoulder. "Brad needs a proper space to run the tech empire he runs, and my parents were so generous to gift us this entire wing of the house." Gift them. The word made my stomach turn. They were playing house in a sinking ship. The camera panned downstairs where Calvin and Renee were hosting what looked like a lavish dinner party for the neighborhood association and several prominent church board members. The dining room table groaned under the weight of catered food. I could see my mother floating between guests wearing a designer dress that cost more than her first car. She was soaking up the compliments about her beautiful family and her successful son-in-law. Then the camera zoomed in on Brad. I was standing by the fireplace holding court with three older wealthy men who usually played golf with my father. Brad was wearing a tailored suit, gesturing wildly as he spoke. I turned up the volume on my tablet to hear his loud, confident voice cutting through the elegant jazz music playing in the background. "It is all about massive crypto investments right now," Brad boasted to the older gentleman who nodded along politely. "You have to be willing to take aggressive risks. My new startup algorithm predicts market fluctuations with unprecedented accuracy. We are looking at a minimum return of 300% by the fourth quarter." It was a spectacular performance of absolute delusion. Brad barely knew how to operate basic spreadsheet software, let alone code a predictive financial algorithm. But my father stood right next to him, beaming with unearned pride, patting Brad on the back, as if he had just discovered the cure for a major disease. Calvin looked at his friends and said, "That is my son-in-law, always ahead of the curve." Watching them parade around my house spending money, they did not have to impress people who did not actually care about them, felt like watching a slow-motion car crash. They were so blinded by their desperation to maintain a perfect upper-class image that they completely ignored the foundational cracks spreading right beneath their expensive leather shoes. They genuinely believed that by kicking me out, they had removed the only obstacle to their ultimate social elevation. They thought my silence was a sign of defeat. They had no idea it was the sound of a trap clicking shut. Jada continued her live stream, walking out to the back patio, where the pool lights glowed a bright neon blue. She leaned into the camera, her perfect makeup catching the light. "A lot of you have been asking about my sister," she whispered, adopting a fake tone of deep sympathy. "We are just praying for her. She had to leave the city to find herself after losing her job. It is so sad when people cannot handle the pressure of success. But our family is staying strong. We are focusing on positivity and the massive new venture of Brad." She blew a kiss to the camera and ended the broadcast. I set my tablet face down on the glass coffee table. The sheer audacity of her lies was breathtaking. She was using my supposed mental breakdown as a prop to garner sympathy and boost her social media engagement. She was painting me as a fragile failure while literally sleeping under a roof that my hard-earned money had secured. I was about to close my laptop when my phone chimed with a harsh notification sound. It was a text message from Aunt Valerie. She was the older sister of my father and the only person in the entire extended family who had ever shown me genuine kindness. Unlike my parents, she cared nothing about club politics. She lived a quiet life in a modest townhouse, and she saw right through the obsession of my mother with status. The message was long, and the first few words made the blood freeze in my veins. Simone, please tell me you know what Calvin and Renee just did. I am sick to my stomach. I called her immediately. Valerie answered on the first ring, her breathing heavy and ragged. Aunt Val, what is going on? I asked, keeping my voice as steady as possible. Oh, Simone, she cried, her voice breaking with genuine distress. I was just at the house for that ridiculous party they are throwing. I overheard your father talking to his accountant in the study. I did not mean to snoop, but the door was cracked open. Simone, they took it. They took everything. Took what I demanded, standing up from my chair and pacing across the hardwood floor of my office. The education trust, she whispered. The fund your grandmother left for you. The one that was supposed to unlock when you turned 35. I stopped pacing. My grandmother had passed away a decade ago, leaving a substantial trust fund, specifically designated for the education of my future children or my own advanced degrees. It was a sacred family asset locked away under my parents' guardianship until I reached a certain age. What do you mean they took it? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous low pitch. They drained it. Simone. Valerie sobbed. Your father found a loophole in the guardianship clause because you are unmarried. He convinced the bank to release the funds. He told the accountant he needed the cash to provide seed money for the company of Brad. He gave the money of your grandmother to that useless white boy. The room spun for a fraction of a second. The betrayal was so profound, so meticulously cruel, that it temporarily robbed me of my breath. They did not just evict me from the house I funded. They did not just demand I cash out my own retirement to fund the fake lifestyle of Brad. They actively went behind my back and stole the only piece of financial legacy my grandmother had left specifically for me. They stole my future to fund the absolute lie of a white man. Valerie was still crying on the telephone, weeping and apologizing over and over for not knowing sooner, for not being able to stop them. I told her to stop apologizing. I thanked her for her loyalty and promised her I was perfectly safe. After I hung up the phone, the silence in my massive beachfront home felt heavy and thick. I walked into the master bathroom and stared at my reflection in the wide, illuminated mirror. I expected to see tears. I expected to see a broken woman. But the eyes staring back at me were completely dry and burning with a terrifying clarity. They had crossed the final boundary. They had taken a sacred gift from a dead woman to prop up a parasite. There was no more room for hesitation. There was no more room for familial duty. It was time to burn their fake empire to the ground. I walked back to my desk and opened my laptop with purposeful precision. I logged into my secure banking portal and pulled up the mortgage account for the Atlanta property. For 4 years, I had dutifully transferred thousands of dollars every single month to keep that enormous loan in good standing. My parents had convinced the bank to put their names on the deed for the sake of appearances, claiming it was a point of pride for older black couples in their circle to officially own such a grand estate. But they lacked the actual income to qualify for the loan. So I had legally signed as the sole financial guarantor. I was the only person keeping the bank from taking the keys. I clicked on the payment settings and located the recurring transfer mandate. I did not feel an ounce of guilt as my finger hovered over the trackpad. I hit cancel. A small green checkmark appeared on the screen confirming the action. But that was not enough. I needed to accelerate the timeline. I picked up my phone and called the executive mortgage broker at the bank. I identified myself using my security PIN and explicitly informed them that I was formally withdrawing my financial backing for the property due to a complete loss of confidence in the deed holders. I informed the bank that the primary residents had zero legitimate income and were currently engaging in highly risky financial behavior. The banker sounded alarmed but confirmed my request, since the account was already flagged for late property taxes that my father had promised to pay and failed to do so. My formal withdrawal of support triggered an immediate red flag in their system. The bank would not wait 30 days to see if Calvin and Renee could come up with the money. They would initiate default protocols immediately. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my ergonomic chair looking out at the beautiful blue ocean. The trap was set. The timer was ticking. Exactly 4 days later, the mail carrier arrived at the Grand Estate in Atlanta. Brad was nursing a hangover from his latest expensive dinner party when he casually opened the thick, certified envelope bearing the official bank logo. I expected a routine monthly statement. Instead, he found a formal notice of foreclosure and demand for immediate payment. The letter explicitly stated that the financial guarantor had permanently severed all ties, and the bank was initiating proceedings to seize the property within 14 days, unless the entire outstanding balance of $2 million was paid in full. Panic erupted through the house like a shockwave. Brad screamed for Jada. Jada screamed for Calvin. My mother collapsed onto the kitchen island, clutching the devastating letter. Their perfect world was instantly vaporized. In a state of absolute frenzy, Calvin hired a private tech specialist to trace the login location of my last known email. He was desperate to find me and force me to fix the mess. The tracking software traced my internet protocol address straight to the island of Martha's Vineyard. Calvin and Renee assumed I was hiding in a cheap, miserable motel room crying over my lost job. They immediately booked the next available flight to Massachusetts, fueled by furious entitlement and arrogant rage. They packed their designer luggage with complete confidence, imagining the exact speeches they would use to break my spirit one last time. They believed they held all the power in this twisted dynamic. They were coming to conquer a broken woman, but the broken woman no longer existed. I was ready to greet them with open arms and a finalized eviction notice. The absolute storm was coming for them, and they had absolutely no idea they were walking straight into the jaws of a billionaire who was waiting patiently on the balcony of a custom-built fortress. Now the ultimate endgame begins. They were about to learn that actions have severe consequences when the money dries up. I will show no mercy. Back in Atlanta, my family wasted zero time claiming the spoils of their perceived victory. From the quiet sanctuary of my oceanfront estate, I watched the illusion of their grandeur unfold in real time. Jada had always been obsessed with projecting a flawless image to the elite circles of our community, and she took to social media to broadcast her new reality. I sat on my plush linen sofa drinking a glass of sparkling water while her live video stream played on my tablet. She was walking through the grand hallways of the house I was still secretly paying for while holding a glass of expensive champagne. She turned the camera to show off my former bedroom. The walls had already been repainted a stark, sterile white. My custom bookshelves and heavy oak desk were completely gone, replaced by cheap modern furniture that looked like it belonged in a heavily filtered catalog. "Welcome to our new executive suite," Jada squealed to her viewers, flipping her long hair over her shoulder. "Brad needs a proper space to run the tech empire he runs, and my parents were so generous to gift us this entire wing of the house." Gift them. The word made my stomach turn. They were playing house in a sinking ship. The camera panned downstairs where Calvin and Renee were hosting what looked like a lavish dinner party for the neighborhood association and several prominent church board members. The dining room table groaned under the weight of catered food. I could see my mother floating between guests wearing a designer dress that cost more than her first car. She was soaking up the compliments about her beautiful family and her successful son-in-law. Then the camera zoomed in on Brad. I was standing by the fireplace holding court with three older wealthy men who usually played golf with my father. Brad was wearing a tailored suit, gesturing wildly as he spoke. I turned up the volume on my tablet to hear his loud, confident voice cutting through the elegant jazz music playing in the background. "It is all about massive crypto investments right now," Brad boasted to the older gentleman who nodded along politely. "You have to be willing to take aggressive risks. My new startup algorithm predicts market fluctuations with unprecedented accuracy. We are looking at a minimum return of 300% by the fourth quarter." It was a spectacular performance of absolute delusion. Brad barely knew how to operate basic spreadsheet software, let alone code a predictive financial algorithm. But my father stood right next to him, beaming with unearned pride, patting Brad on the back, as if he had just discovered the cure for a major disease. Calvin looked at his friends and said, "That is my son-in-law, always ahead of the curve." Watching them parade around my house spending money, they did not have to impress people who did not actually care about them, felt like watching a slow-motion car crash. They were so blinded by their desperation to maintain a perfect upper-class image that they completely ignored the foundational cracks spreading right beneath their expensive leather shoes. They genuinely believed that by kicking me out, they had removed the only obstacle to their ultimate social elevation. They thought my silence was a sign of defeat. They had no idea it was the sound of a trap clicking shut. Jada continued her live stream, walking out to the back patio, where the pool lights glowed a bright neon blue. She leaned into the camera, her perfect makeup catching the light. "A lot of you have been asking about my sister," she whispered, adopting a fake tone of deep sympathy. "We are just praying for her. She had to leave the city to find herself after losing her job. It is so sad when people cannot handle the pressure of success. But our family is staying strong. We are focusing on positivity and the massive new venture of Brad." She blew a kiss to the camera and ended the broadcast. I set my tablet face down on the glass coffee table. The sheer audacity of her lies was breathtaking. She was using my supposed mental breakdown as a prop to garner sympathy and boost her social media engagement. She was painting me as a fragile failure while literally sleeping under a roof that my hard-earned money had secured. I was about to close my laptop when my phone chimed with a harsh notification sound. It was a text message from Aunt Valerie. She was the older sister of my father and the only person in the entire extended family who had ever shown me genuine kindness. Unlike my parents, she cared nothing about club politics. She lived a quiet life in a modest townhouse, and she saw right through the obsession of my mother with status. The message was long, and the first few words made the blood freeze in my veins. "Simone, please tell me you know what Calvin and Renee just did. I am sick to my stomach." I called her immediately. Valerie answered on the first ring, her breathing heavy and ragged. "Aunt Val, what is going on?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "Oh, Simone," she cried, her voice breaking with genuine distress. "I was just at the house for that ridiculous party they are throwing. I overheard your father talking to his accountant in the study. I did not mean to snoop, but the door was cracked open. Simone, they took it. They took everything. Took what I demanded, standing up from my chair and pacing across the hardwood floor of my office. "The education trust," she whispered. "The fund your grandmother left for you. The one that was supposed to unlock when you turned 35. I stopped pacing. My grandmother had passed away a decade ago, leaving a substantial trust fund specifically designated for the education of my future children or my own advanced degrees. It was a sacred family asset locked away under my parents' guardianship until I reached a certain age." "What do you mean they took it?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous low pitch. "They drained it," Simone, Valerie sobbed. "Your father found a loophole in the guardianship clause because you are unmarried. He convinced the bank to release the funds. He told the accountant he needed the cash to provide seed money for the company of Brad. He gave the money of your grandmother to that useless white boy." The room spun for a fraction of a second. The betrayal was so profound, so meticulously cruel, that it temporarily robbed me of my breath. They did not just evict me from the house I funded. They did not just demand I cash out my own retirement to fund the fake lifestyle of Brad. They actively went behind my back and stole the only piece of financial legacy my grandmother had left specifically for me. They stole my future to fund the absolute lie of a white man. Valerie was still crying on the telephone, weeping and apologizing over and over for not knowing sooner, for not being able to stop them. I told her to stop apologizing. I thanked her for her loyalty and promised her I was perfectly safe. After I hung up the phone, the silence in my massive beachfront home felt heavy and thick. I walked into the master bathroom and stared at my reflection in the wide illuminated mirror. I expected to see tears. I expected to see a broken woman. But the eyes staring back at me were completely dry and burning with a terrifying clarity. They had crossed the final boundary. They had taken a sacred gift from a dead woman to prop up a parasite. There was no more room for hesitation. There was no more room for familial duty. It was time to burn their fake empire to the ground. I walked back to my desk and opened my laptop with purposeful precision. I logged into my secure banking portal and pulled up the mortgage account for the Atlanta property. For 4 years, I had dutifully transferred thousands of dollars every single month to keep that enormous loan in good standing. My parents had convinced the bank to put their names on the deed for the sake of appearances, claiming it was a point of pride for older black couples in their circle to officially own such a grand estate. But they lacked the actual income to qualify for the loan, so I had legally signed as the sole financial guarantor. I was the only person keeping the bank from taking the keys. I clicked on the payment settings and located the recurring transfer mandate. I did not feel an ounce of guilt as my finger hovered over the trackpad. I hit cancel. A small green checkmark appeared on the screen confirming the action. But that was not enough. I needed to accelerate the timeline. I picked up my phone and called the executive mortgage broker at the bank. I identified myself using my security PIN and explicitly informed them that I was formally withdrawing my financial backing for the property due to a complete loss of confidence in the deed holders. I informed the bank that the primary residents had zero legitimate income and were currently engaging in highly risky financial behavior. The banker sounded alarmed but confirmed my request. Since the account was already flagged for late property taxes that my father had promised to pay and failed to do so, my formal withdrawal of support triggered an immediate red flag in their system. The bank would not wait 30 days to see if Calvin and Renee could come up with the money. They would initiate default protocols immediately. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my ergonomic chair looking out at the beautiful blue ocean. The trap was set. The timer was ticking. Exactly 4 days later, the mail carrier arrived at the grand estate in Atlanta. Brad was nursing a hangover from his latest expensive dinner party when he casually opened the thick certified envelope bearing the official bank logo. He expected a routine monthly statement. Instead, he found a formal notice of foreclosure and demand for immediate payment. The letter explicitly stated that the financial guarantor had permanently severed all ties, and the bank was initiating proceedings to seize the property within 14 days, unless the entire outstanding balance of $2 million was paid in full. Panic erupted through the house like a shockwave. Brad screamed for Jada. Jada screamed for Calvin. My mother collapsed onto the kitchen island clutching the devastating letter. Their perfect world was instantly vaporized. In a state of absolute frenzy, Calvin hired a private tech specialist to trace the login location of my last known email. He was desperate to find me and force me to fix the mess. The tracking software traced my internet protocol address straight to the island of Martha's Vineyard. Calvin and Renee assumed I was hiding in a cheap, miserable motel room crying over my lost job. They immediately booked the next available flight to Massachusetts, fueled by furious entitlement and arrogant rage. They packed their designer luggage with complete confidence, imagining the exact speeches they would use to break my spirit one last time. They believed they held all the power in this twisted dynamic. They were coming to conquer a broken woman. But the broken woman no longer existed. I was ready to greet them with open arms and a finalized eviction notice. The absolute storm was coming for them, and they had absolutely no idea they were walking straight into the jaws of a billionaire who was waiting patiently on the balcony of a custom-built fortress. Now the ultimate endgame begins. They were about to learn that actions have severe consequences when the money dries up. I will show no mercy. After my security team escorted my screaming family off my property, the silence that settled over my estate was absolute perfection. I stood on the balcony, letting the cool ocean breeze wash over me while the information from my private investigator settled in my mind. Brad had not just lost the education trust fund my grandmother left for me. He had forged the signature of my father to take out a predatory loan from a highly dangerous local lender using the retirement account of my father as collateral. The sheer magnitude of his deception was breathtaking, but I felt no pity for my father. Calvin had handed the keys to his financial kingdom to a fast-talking white man who possessed zero actual skills simply because he wanted a son-in-law who looked like a country club catalog model. Back in Atlanta, the chaos was just beginning, humiliated and completely terrified of losing their elite status. My parents returned to the city with a venomous new narrative. They could not exactly tell their wealthy friends that they had been thrown out of a multi-million-dollar mansion owned by the daughter they claimed was a bankrupt failure. Instead, they doubled down on the lies. My mother began calling every prominent member of their social circle. She spun a tragic tale about how my mental health had completely deteriorated. She told the ladies at her exclusive country club and the elders at our family church that I had suffered a psychotic break after losing my corporate marketing job. She claimed I had retreated to a bizarre fantasy world where I believed I was secretly wealthy and had hired actors to pretend to be my security guards. It was a masterful performance of absolute delusion. She cried on the telephone asking for prayers for her deeply disturbed eldest daughter while soaking up the sympathy of her peers. Calvin played the role of the stoic, heartbroken patriarch perfectly. To prove to everyone in the community that they were still at the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta society, they decided to push forward with their extravagant 35th anniversary gala. The bank had already initiated the foreclosure process on the house they were living in, but Calvin willfully ignored the warning letters arriving in the mail. He threw the notices in the trash, convincing himself that he could secure a bridge loan or charm his way out of the debt just like he always did. Renee went into a manic spending spree to prove they were not struggling. She ordered custom floral arrangements imported directly from Holland and upgraded the catering menu at the Heritage Country Club to include top-tier caviar and truffles. They were hemorrhaging money. They did not have desperately trying to build a thick wall of luxury to hide the fact that they were completely bankrupt. While my parents were busy picking out expensive linens for their party, Brad was living in a state of absolute terror. My private investigator kept me updated on his every frantic move. The predatory lenders Brad had borrowed money from were not the kind of people who accepted excuses or business buzzwords. They wanted their cash, and now that the tech startup facade was crumbling, Brad was trapped like a rat. He started sweating through his tailored suits during family dinners. He began drinking heavily in the middle of the day, hiding empty liquor bottles in the garage behind the gardening tools. Desperation makes people incredibly sloppy, and Brad was no exception. He needed cash immediately just to make a minimum interest payment to the men threatening his life. He convinced Jada that her diamond tennis bracelet needed a professional cleaning before the big gala. Jada, always eager to look flawless, handed it over without a single second thought. Brad drove straight to a high-end pawn shop on the other side of town and sold her jewelry for a fraction of its true value. He handed that money over to a menacing man in a parking garage just to buy himself a few more days of breathing room. When that money was gone, he turned his sights on my father. Calvin kept a pristine vintage classic car in the garage, a vehicle he treated better than he treated me. Brad took photographs of the vehicle identification number and tried to secretly list the car on an underground online forum, hoping to find a quick cash buyer who would not ask too many questions. The tension inside that foreclosed house must have been suffocating. Brad was jumping at every shadow, while Calvin strutted around giving him terrible business advice and patting him on the back. Through all of this impending doom, Jada remained willfully blind. She completely ignored the smell of cheap alcohol on the breath of her husband. She ignored the frantic phone calls he took in the bathroom with the water running to muffle his voice. Her entire existence was hyper-focused on the anniversary gala. She was determined to be the most beautiful woman in the room, to prove to the world that marrying Brad was the greatest achievement in the history of our family. She spent her days at luxury boutiques and her evenings taking selfies in the mirror. She was obsessively polishing a chandelier on a rapidly sinking ship, completely unaware that her husband had essentially sold her future to criminals. I did not just want to pull the rug out from under them. I wanted to dismantle their entire stage while the spotlight was shining directly on them. 3 days before the gala, I boarded my private flight and returned to Atlanta. I did not go anywhere near my old neighborhood. I checked into a luxury penthouse suite at a five-star hotel right in the heart of downtown. The view of the city skyline was spectacular, but I was not there to admire the architecture. I was there to orchestrate a masterpiece of consequences. The next morning, I held a private meeting in my hotel suite. My legal team was present along with the general manager of the Heritage Country Club. The manager, a distinguished older man who had catered to the ridiculous demands of my parents for years, looked incredibly nervous sitting across the glass table from me. I had just purchased the debt portfolio of the entire club, making me his ultimate employer and the sole owner of the property. I handed him a very specific set of instructions for the night of the gala. I told him to let my parents rack up whatever extravagant charges they wanted. I instructed him to let them order the most expensive vintage champagne in the cellar. I told him to let them extend the event hours and demand extra staff. I wanted them to truly believe they were the kings and queens of the city for one last night. But I also requested full administrative access to the audiovisual equipment in the main ballroom. My dedicated tech team spent the entire afternoon at the club, syncing the massive projector screens and the surround sound system to a secure remote application on my personal phone. We ran multiple tests to ensure the audio would be crystal clear and impossible to override from the DJ booth. The trap was set perfectly. It was flawless and completely inescapable. I was going to give my family exactly the kind of public attention they had craved their entire lives. The night before the gala, I was sitting on the velvet sofa in my penthouse, reviewing the final financial documents my lawyers had prepared, outlining the complete ruin of Brad. My phone vibrated on the table. It was a text message from an unknown number, but I recognized the arrogant tone immediately. It was Jada. She had bypassed the block I put on her phone number by using a burner application. The message contained a full-length mirror selfie of her wearing a spectacular custom-beaded gown. The dress alone easily cost $5,000 money she definitely did not have. Beneath the photograph, she had typed a vicious message intended to break my spirit. "I know you are probably sitting in some cheap motel going crazy with jealousy," Jada wrote. "Do not even think about trying to crash our party tomorrow. I gave security your picture and told them you are mentally unstable and dangerous. You are nothing to us now. You are just white trash in a black family. Stay away, loser." I read the message and felt a genuine peaceful smile spread across my face. She was so confident in her cruelty, so incredibly secure in her fake superiority. In the past, a message like that would have made me cry. I would have felt the deep sting of rejection from the sister I had financially supported for years. But now her words meant absolutely nothing. I did not type out a long, angry response defending myself. I did not try to explain that I literally owned the building where she planned to flaunt her unpaid dress. I did not warn her that her husband was a fraud who was about to leave her drowning in criminal debt. I simply tapped my screen and sent back a single thumbs-up emoji. Then I turned off my phone, placed it on the nightstand, and went to sleep. I slept deeply and completely, without a single nightmare or moment of doubt. I was completely at peace, knowing that tomorrow would be the most unforgettable night of their entire lives. They had spent 32 years underestimating me and taking my sacrifices for granted. They had thrown me out into the street because they thought I had lost my value. Tomorrow I would show them exactly how valuable I truly was, and I would make sure they never forgot the name of the daughter they tried to destroy. The evening of the 35th anniversary gala arrived with a suffocating blanket of humidity over the city of Atlanta. But inside the Heritage Country Club, the climate was perfectly controlled and thick with the scent of imported white orchids. The grand ballroom was a spectacular display of desperate extravagance. My parents had spared absolutely no financial expense to maintain the grand illusion of their massive wealth. Huge crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over dozens of round tables draped in heavy ivory silk. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated effortlessly through the room, carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar smoked salmon canapes and tall glasses of expensive vintage champagne. The guest list was a carefully curated collection of the most influential African American figures in the entire state of Georgia. There were local politicians seated next to megachurch pastors and wealthy real estate developers mingling with corporate executives. It was the absolute pinnacle of high society networking, and my parents were working the room like absolute royalty, ensuring every single person saw how magnificent they appeared. Renee was draped in an elaborate custom designer gown that practically dragged across the polished marble floor with a long, dramatic train. She was wearing a heavy diamond necklace that she had undoubtedly convinced a high-end jeweler to loan her for the evening, just to complete her wealthy matriarch aesthetic. She floated from table to table, laughing loudly at terrible jokes and soaking up the deep admiration of her peers. She accepted their glowing compliments with a fake humility, playing the role of the devoted, faithful wife while actively hiding the terrifying fact that her primary residence was currently in the final stages of a brutal bank foreclosure. Calvin looked equally polished in a bespoke velvet tuxedo holding a crystal tumbler of expensive aged scotch. I was standing near a massive, elaborate ice sculpture in the center of the room, telling highly exaggerated stories about his past business successes to anyone who would listen. They looked so completely secure in their fake reality, so deeply entrenched in their own complex web of lies, that it was almost impressive to witness their dedication to the performance. Jada and Brad were holding court near the main mahogany bar located at the edge of the dance floor. Jada was wearing the $5,000 beaded gown she had proudly texted me a picture of the night before, acting as if she owned the entire building. She was posing for photographs with the wives of various local politicians, making sure everyone noticed the expensive fabric and the intricate beadwork of her dress. She completely ignored the dark reality that her husband had just pawned her valuable jewelry to pay off dangerous loan sharks. Brad was leaning against the bar, sweating slightly under the tight collar of his tailored suit, but trying his absolute best to look like a visionary technology founder. He was loudly discussing market trends and venture capital funding, using meaningless business buzzwords to sound highly intelligent. The people around him nodded politely, completely unaware that the man giving them aggressive investment advice had just drained the retirement account of his father-in-law to cover his massive gambling debts. The entire family was participating in a spectacular collective delusion that was about to shatter into a million pieces. As the main dinner service concluded, and the busy waiters began clearing the fine china plates, Calvin confidently walked up the steps to the main stage. The string quartet slowly faded into silence as he tapped his silver spoon against his champagne glass to command the full attention of the crowded ballroom. The room went quiet immediately, and all eyes turned respectfully toward my father. He grabbed the microphone with a wide, charismatic smile and began to deliver the most hypocritical, arrogant speech I had ever heard in my entire life. He talked at great length about the vital importance of strong family values and the sacred duty of building generational wealth for the Black community. He spoke passionately about the 35 years of marriage he had shared with Renee, describing it as a beautiful journey of unwavering loyalty and deep mutual sacrifice. The elite crowd murmured their warm approval and clapped politely as Renee dramatically wiped a fake tear from her eye, playing the part of the adoring emotional wife to absolute perfection. Then Calvin turned his attention to the future of our family lineage and the legacy he claimed to be building. He gestured enthusiastically for Brad to join him on the brightly lit stage. Brad walked up the steps, trying his best to look humble and successful, as my father put a heavy, supportive arm around his narrow shoulders. Calvin looked out at the sea of wealthy investors and politicians and proudly introduced his white son-in-law. He called Brad a brilliant mind and a shining bright example of the modern entrepreneurial spirit. He told the captive audience that Brad was currently developing a revolutionary software platform that would change the global technology industry forever, bringing immense pride and wealth to the family name. He bragged openly about the immense pride he felt having such a dedicated and successful man married to his youngest daughter. He praised Jada for being the perfect, supportive, gorgeous wife standing by her man as he built his empire. Through this entire 20-minute speech, Calvin did not mention my name a single time. He completely erased my entire existence from the family narrative, ensuring that his wealthy friends only knew about the golden child and her supposedly successful husband. The audience erupted into loud applause, raising their expensive glasses in a cheerful toast to the continued prosperity of our family. I was waiting patiently in the private shadowy vestibule just outside the grand ballroom, listening to the sickening echo of their applause through the heavy oak doors. I had timed my arrival with absolute flawless precision. My private security team was positioned strategically around the perimeter of the building, ensuring that no club employees could interfere with my dramatic entrance. I checked my reflection in the tall gilded mirror one last time, preparing myself mentally for the chaos I was about to unleash. I was not dressed like a woman who had just lost her corporate job or a desperate daughter who had been thrown out into the cold street. I was wearing a breathtaking emerald green couture gown that fit my body absolutely flawlessly, highlighting every curve. The heavy silk fabric caught the ambient light with every subtle movement I made, making me look ethereal and dominant. My hair was styled in an elegant, sophisticated updo, and my makeup was completely immaculate, highlighting my sharp features. I wore a simple but blindingly authentic diamond tlit and matching earrings that easily cost more than the entire catering budget for the evening. I radiated a heavy, terrifying aura of absolute untouchable power and profound confidence. I took a deep breath, letting the anger of the past 32 years wash away, leaving only cold calculation. I gave a subtle nod to the event staff standing nervously near the entrance. The heavy oak doors swung open wide, revealing the massive crowded ballroom. I stepped across the threshold and walked slowly into the grand space. My posture was perfectly straight, and my high heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, cutting through the soft background noise. The string quartet had just started playing a soft rhythm and blues melody, but the music seemed to fade away as a sudden ripple of whispers started at the back of the room. Heads began to turn one by one as the guests noticed the new arrival. The quiet, elegant chatter of the elite crowd slowly died down as they watched me gliding down the center aisle. People parted ways to let me pass, staring openly at my stunning emerald gown and the intense look of authority etched onto my face. Some of the older guests recognized me from previous years and began murmuring quietly to their neighbors, deeply confused as to why the supposedly unstable, estranged daughter was making such a powerful, dramatic entrance instead of hiding away in a mental facility like my mother had claimed. The sheer contrast between the crazy woman my mother had described and the polished billionaire walking into the room was jarring enough to silence the entire crowd. Jada was standing near the extravagant dessert table holding a plate of chocolate truffles when she finally spotted me walking toward the stage. The smug, victorious smile instantly vanished from her perfectly contoured face, replaced by a look of sheer terror. The color drained completely from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and sick. Her eyes widened in pure panic as she stared at the gown I was wearing, knowing instantly that it was an exclusive high-fashion piece she could never dream of affording. For a split second, she was paralyzed by pure shock, but her vicious survival instinct quickly kicked into high gear. She dropped her plate onto a nearby table, shattering the porcelain into dozens of pieces, and began frantically waving her arms in the air to get attention. She snapped her fingers aggressively and yelled across the quiet ballroom, trying to catch the attention of the private security guards stationed along the velvet ropes. She pointed a shaking acrylic fingernail directly at my chest. She screamed that I was a trespasser and a dangerous, unstable stalker who had absolutely no right to be there. She ordered the guards to grab me and throw me out into the street, immediately claiming I was violent and actively trying to ruin her highly anticipated family event. The elite crowd watched in hushed, confused silence as this messy family drama erupted right in front of them, completely shattering the elegant atmosphere of the anniversary gala. Three burly security guards dressed in dark tactical suits heard the loud commotion and immediately started marching aggressively in my direction. Their expressions were stern and uncompromising, fully intending to physically restrain me and remove me from the premises to protect the peace of the wealthy country club members. Jada crossed her arms over her chest and lifted her chin, looking incredibly smug and victorious despite her initial panic. She was fully expecting to watch me get dragged out of the ballroom by my elbows, humiliated and crying in front of the entire upper-class community of Atlanta. Up on the main stage, Calvin and Renee had frozen completely like statues. Their faces were masks of pure, absolute horror, as they watched their discarded scapegoat daughter command the complete attention of the entire room. They stood there, paralyzed, unable to comprehend how I had bypassed the strict guest list at the front door and managed to infiltrate their perfect sanctuary of lies. I did not stop walking. I did not flinch or break my steady, confident stride, even as the three massive security guards closed in around me. I kept my eyes locked directly on the panicked, horrified face of my mother, refusing to show a single ounce of fear or intimidation. Before the guards could even come within 10 feet of me to grab my arms, the general manager of the country club suddenly sprinted across the polished dance floor. I was moving much faster than an older gentleman should be able to move, his face completely slick with nervous sweat. He practically shoved the largest security guard out of his way, waving his hands frantically in the air to stop them from touching me. "Stand down," he barked at the confused guards, his voice trembling with sheer panic and authority. He positioned himself squarely between me and the security team, breathing heavily as he nervously smoothed down his suit jacket and wiped his forehead. The general manager, a highly distinguished man who had catered to the arrogant, petty demands of my parents for over a decade, turned slowly to face me. He did not ask to see my invitation or question my presence in the building. He did not tell me to leave the premises or ask for an explanation. Instead, he bowed his head slightly in a highly visible, undeniable gesture of profound respect and submission. I ignored my screaming, frantic sister entirely and focused all of his professional attention directly on me. "Miss Simone," he said, his voice echoing clearly across the dead-silent ballroom, carrying to every single guest in the vicinity. "Your private VIP table is ready right by the main stage, exactly as you requested. Please let me know immediately if the ambient lighting is to your satisfaction, or if you require the catering staff to adjust the current menu for your personal guests tonight. We are completely at your absolute service this evening and hope you enjoy the property." The entire ballroom went completely dead silent. The string quartet stopped playing abruptly, leaving only the uncomfortable sound of ice clinking in glasses and the nervous breathing of the crowd. The wealthy politicians, the mega-church leaders, and the elite business owners simply stared in total bewilderment at the scene unfolding before them. The general manager of the most exclusive country club in the state had just bowed to the very woman they had all been told was a psychotic, bankrupt failure, suffering from a mental breakdown. He had addressed me with the kind of deep deference usually reserved only for royalty or primary corporate stakeholders. Up on the stage, Calvin gripped the microphone stand so hard his knuckles turned completely white and his jaw visibly trembled as he stared at the scene. Brad looked like he was about to physically vomit. His fake confidence completely evaporated into thin air as he realized the magnitude of my presence. Jada was standing with her mouth hanging wide open, completely incapable of understanding why the security guards were now backing away, apologizing and returning to their posts, instead of dragging me out into the cold night. The sheer devastating embarrassment of the situation finally snapped my mother out of her paralyzed, frozen state. Renee marched aggressively down the steps of the stage, her heavy silk dress swishing loudly around her ankles. Her face was twisted in a terrible mask of absolute rage and deep public humiliation. She stomped over to where I was standing, stopping just inches from my face, trying to use her physical presence to intimidate me one last time in front of her friends. She glared at me with pure hatred, her chest heaving as she tried to keep her voice low enough to avoid a massive public shouting match, but failing miserably. "What kind of sick, vindictive stunt are you trying to pull, Simone?" she demanded, her eyes darting nervously toward the silent watching crowd of her judgmental peers. "You are ruining our entire night and destroying this family." I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger in response to her venom. I looked at her completely unfazed by her fury, projecting nothing but calm, untouchable control. Then I raised my hand and gave a very subtle, clear nod to the audio technician waiting patiently in the sound booth at the back of the room. "No, Mother," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady, cutting through the heavy silence of the ballroom. "I am just correcting the guest list." The heavy silence in the room felt like a physical weight pressing down on every single person present. My mother stared at me with her mouth slightly open, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the situation. I stepped past her frozen form and made my way toward the center of the stage. The general manager of the country club hurried ahead of me carrying a silver microphone, which he handed to me with a deep bow of respect. I took the microphone and turned to face the sea of wealthy politicians, elite business owners, and prominent church leaders. They were all watching me with unblinking attention, completely captivated by the sudden shift in power. I looked down at my father, who was still gripping the edges of his podium, looking as if the floor had just dropped out from beneath his feet. I smiled warmly at the crowd, letting a moment of perfect calm wash over me before I began to speak. "Welcome everyone to the Heritage Country Club," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive ballroom speakers. I know my father has spent the evening sharing wonderful stories about our family legacy, but there are a few important updates to the financial reality of this establishment that I feel obligated to share with you all tonight. As the new owner of the entire debt portfolio of this country club, I sincerely hope you are enjoying the vintage champagne and the imported caviar. The collective gasp from the elite crowd was instantaneous and incredibly loud. The wealthy guests exchanged shocked glances, whispering frantically to one another as they processed the reality of my statement. They were standing inside a building that was heavily mortgaged, and I had just announced that I held the absolute financial control over the very ground they were standing on. Calvin dropped his crystal glass of expensive scotch. It hit the stage floor and shattered into pieces, sending amber liquid splashing across his polished leather shoes. His jaw was literally hanging open, his eyes wide with a profound, terrifying realization. He had spent the last 20 minutes bragging to the most powerful Black leaders in Atlanta about his generational wealth and his flawless family image. Now the daughter he had cruelly evicted and publicly shamed was standing in front of him, completely dismantling his entire fabricated empire with a single sentence. Renee looked like she was going to physically collapse. She grabbed the edge of a nearby table, her knuckles turning white as she struggled to breathe. The women from her exclusive social circles, who had spent the evening listening to her fake stories of pity and concern for my mental health, were now staring at her with expressions of deep suspicion and sheer disgust. They realized immediately that my mother had been feeding them a complex diet of pathological lies. I did not break my eye contact with the crowd. I stood tall and regal in my emerald green gown, letting the absolute authority of my position resonate through the massive ballroom. I explained to the guests that I had recently acquired a substantial cybersecurity firm and had chosen to invest a small portion of my new billionaire wealth into distressed local real estate. I told them it was a passion project of mine to clean up toxic liabilities and restore true value to the community. Every single word I spoke was a calculated strike against the fake prestige of my parents. They had built their entire identity on the illusion of superiority, and I was peeling it away layer by layer in front of the exact audience they desperately wanted to impress. The atmosphere in the room shifted entirely from a celebration of fake success to a captivating masterclass in brutal accountability. Jada could not handle the shift in attention. She had spent weeks preparing for this night, dreaming of being the most beautiful and envied woman in the room. Now she was completely marginalized, standing near the dessert table in a dress she could not afford, watching me dominate the space. Her fragile ego snapped completely. She stomped her feet on the floor and began screaming at the top of her lungs, trying to interrupt my speech and regain control of the narrative. She yelled that I was lying and that I was just a jealous, bitter woman trying to ruin her perfect family life. She pointed her finger at me, demanding that someone call the police to have me arrested for trespassing and harassment. Her voice echoed shrilly across the room, completely devoid of any elegance or class. The wealthy guests recoiled from her outburst, looking at her with overwhelming second-hand embarrassment. I did not raise my voice or show any sign of irritation. I simply looked at the audio-visual technician sitting in the booth at the back of the ballroom and gave him a prearranged signal. The technician nodded and pressed a button on his control panel. The heavy velvet curtains behind the main stage slowly parted, revealing two massive projector screens. The screens flickered to life, casting a bright white glow over the stunned family members standing below. A massive, highly detailed financial spreadsheet appeared on the screens. It was a comprehensive ledger of every single bill, loan, and luxury expense I had paid on behalf of my family over the past 4 years. I turned back to the microphone, my voice perfectly smooth and conversational. A few days ago, Jada asked me a very important question, I told the crowd, gesturing toward the screens. She stood in the hallway of a house that I was financially backing, and she asked me who would pay the lease on her luxury vehicle since I had lost my corporate job. She was deeply concerned about maintaining her social image in this community. I paused, letting the silence build the tension in the room. The answer to your question, Jada, is nobody. I stopped making the payments. And because your husband is completely broke and your parents are currently facing active foreclosure, that beautiful electric car was not paid for. In fact, I took the liberty of notifying the dealership about your default status. That vehicle was repossessed exactly 1 hour ago from the valet parking lot outside this very building. Jada let out a sound that was half scream and half sob. She dropped her designer clutch and covered her face with her hands, bursting into loud, ugly tears of absolute humiliation. The elite guests began murmuring again, pointing at the detailed spreadsheet on the screens. They could see the staggering amounts of money I had transferred to keep my sister draped in high fashion and my parents living in a mansion they could not afford. The concrete proof of their financial parasitism was displayed for the entire city to see. Jada sank to her knees, right there on the marble floor, weeping uncontrollably as the reality of her new poverty set in. She would not be driving home in a luxury car tonight. She would not be returning to a life of pampered ease. She was nothing more than a broke, dependent woman whose entire identity had just been repossessed along with her vehicle. Her friends from the local social clubs watched her fall apart, making absolutely no move to comfort her. The fake kingdom she had ruled over was completely gone. While Jada was sobbing on the floor and my parents were paralyzed by the public exposure of their financial ruin, Brad realized that his own personal house of cards was about to violently collapse. He was standing near the edge of the dance floor, sweating profusely through his tailored suit jacket. He knew that if I had the financial records of my sister and my parents, I definitely had his records as well. His eyes darted nervously toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom. He started to slowly back away from the crowd, hoping to slip out unnoticed in the middle of the chaos. He planned to abandon his crying wife and his humiliated in-laws to save his own skin. He turned around and began walking quickly toward the exit, keeping his head down and his shoulders hunched. I kept my eyes fixed directly on him. I spoke into the microphone, my voice projecting across the massive room. "Please do not leave just yet, Brad," I said firmly, stopping him dead in his tracks. The entire crowd turned to look at the sweating white man trying to escape out the back door. "We have not even had a chance to talk about your brilliant startup company yet." Brad froze his face, turning an unhealthy shade of pale gray. He looked up and saw two of my massive private security guards stepping directly into his path, completely blocking the exit doors. They crossed their arms over their broad chests, staring down at him with menacing authority. Brad was trapped inside the ballroom with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. He turned back around to face the stage, looking like a terrified animal caught in a snare. His arrogant, confident demeanor had completely evaporated, leaving only a pathetic, cowardly fraud. "Dad." I continued, turning my attention back to Calvin, who was still standing near the podium looking thoroughly defeated. "You spent a significant portion of your speech tonight praising the business acumen of your son-in-law. You told all of your wealthy friends and colleagues that Brad was a visionary founder who was going to build generational wealth for this family. You elevated him above your own daughter and funded his delusional lifestyle because he fit your twisted criteria of success." Calvin refused to look at me, keeping his eyes glued to the shattered glass on the floor. I knew what was coming, and he was completely powerless to stop it. I reached into the small, elegant clutch purse I was holding and pulled out a single folded document. The crisp white paper felt heavy with the weight of absolute destruction. I unfolded it slowly, smoothing out the creases as the massive projector screens behind me shifted to display a highly magnified image of the exact same document. It was a formal loan agreement, meant from a highly dangerous and predatory local lending agency. "You always praised the hustle and the entrepreneurial spirit of Brad," I said, my voice dropping to a serious, commanding tone that demanded the attention of every single person in the room. But did you know that his absolute biggest accomplishment this year was not building a software platform? His biggest accomplishment was forging your personal signature on this document to take out a massive illegal loan. The crowd gasped collectively, the sound filling the grand ballroom like a sudden rush of wind. Calvin finally looked up, his eyes wide with sheer terror as he stared at the giant screen behind me. He recognized the details of the account immediately. He realized exactly what his beloved son-in-law had done. I held the physical document up in the air for emphasis. Brad did not use this money to build a technology empire, I informed the silent, horrified crowd. I used this forged loan to gamble away your entire retirement fund, trying to cover his massive existing debts with dangerous criminals. He sold your future to save himself and left you with absolutely nothing to show for it. I will make certain that every single guest standing in this room sees the absolute truth about how deeply you were betrayed by the man you so blindly worshipped. Your perfect family image has officially been completely destroyed tonight because you chose to support an absolute fraud over the daughter who genuinely loved you. Enjoy the bitter reality of your new empty life. Now please observe him. Calvin took a slow, unsteady step toward the massive projector screen, taking his eyes away from the terrified face of his son-in-law. The bright white light from the digital display illuminated the absolute horror that was now carved deeply into his aging features. He reached out with a trembling, sweating hand and snatched the physical copy of the loan agreement right out of my firm grasp. His eyes darted frantically across the legal page, reading the predatory terms, the exorbitant interest rates, and the horrific total amount that had been aggressively borrowed against his own personal retirement accounts. He read his own forged signature at the very bottom of the page, recognizing immediately that Brad had carefully traced it from old family documents. The man who had spent his entire adult life obsessing over his financial portfolio and his elite status in the Atlanta community was suddenly realizing that he was completely and utterly bankrupt. He had absolutely nothing left to his name except a foreclosed mansion and a mountain of criminal debt. His knees buckled slightly under the crushing weight of the revelation, causing him to physically stumble backward across the polished stage. He bumped heavily into the wooden podium, knocking his glass of expensive imported water to the floor. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the dead silent ballroom, but nobody moved to help him. Every wealthy politician and influential church leader in the room was watching a giant of their exclusive community crumble into dust right before their eyes. Brad slowly turned his head to look at Calvin. The golden boy, the brilliant, supposedly wealthy son-in-law, was backed into a dark corner by my massive private security guard, sweating completely through his tailored designer suit. Brad held his hands up in a pathetic, cowardly gesture of surrender, shaking his head back and forth as if he could somehow magically deny the irrefutable proof displayed on the 50-foot screens behind us. Brad opened his mouth and tried to stammer out a ridiculous excuse, using empty corporate buzzwords to claim it was just a temporary liquidity issue, but his voice squeaked with pure terror. Calvin did not say a single word in response. He did not yell or demand a logical explanation from the man he had blindly worshipped for years. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal completely bypassed his ability to speak and went straight to a place of pure primal rage. Calvin lunged forward, closing the distance between them in 3 massive, angry strides. He pulled his fist back and punched Brad squarely in the jaw with a sickening, heavy crunch. Brad collapsed onto the polished marble floor, crying out in sharp pain and clutching his bleeding face. Total, absolute chaos erupted inside the grand ballroom of the Heritage Country Club. The mayor of Atlanta stepped backward in sheer shock, spilling his dark liquor down his crisp tuxedo front. The senior members of the church council gasped loudly and covered their mouths, stepping quickly away from the physical violence, as if poverty and fraud were highly contagious diseases. Jada, who had been weeping uncontrollably on the floor just moments ago, suddenly snapped out of her misery when she saw her husband fall. She scrambled to her feet and looked at the bleeding, pathetic man she called her soulmate. The realization hit her like a speeding freight train. Her perfect marriage, her luxury electric cars, her designer clothes, and her entire carefully curated social identity were all funded by illegal loans and stolen money. She was not a wealthy socialite, she was the wife of a desperate criminal. Jada lunged at Brad, screaming at the top of her lungs with zero regard for her audience. She hit his chest with her acrylic nails and demanded to know where all the money was hiding. She called him a pathetic fraud, a disgusting liar, and a useless, miserable failure, right in front of the wealthy women she had spent years trying to desperately impress. The flawless facade of their beautiful high society marriage shattered instantly into a million irreparable pieces, leaving only an ugly, desperate truth for everyone to witness. My mother, Renee, could not handle the absolute destruction of her perfect, prestigious world. Her husband was physically attacking her son-in-law on the floor of an elite country club. Her golden child was screaming like a maniac, tearing at the clothes of her bleeding husband. Her entire social circle was watching her family completely implode with expressions of deep disgust and sheer overwhelming pity. Rennie had spent 35 years meticulously building a fortress of lies and social climbing, and she was watching it all burn to the ground in less than 20 minutes. Desperate to save even a tiny fraction of her dignity, she decided to rely on her favorite and most predictable tactic. She decided to blame the scapegoat. Rennie marched aggressively across the stage, her heavy silk designer gown dragging clumsily behind her. She stopped right in front of me, her chest heaving with exertion and blind panic. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes wild with a frantic, desperate energy. She did not care that her husband was completely bankrupt or that her son-in-law was a documented criminal. She only cared about redirecting the intense public shame away from her own massive failures as a mother and a wife. "You planned this!" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria as she tried to shout over the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. "You hateful, spiteful girl. You destroyed your own family out of pure toxic jealousy because you could never be as beautiful or as loved as your sister. You orchestrated this entire circus just to humiliate us tonight because you are a sick, miserable, jealous woman." The wealthy crowd murmured at her sudden outburst, expecting me to scream back or aggressively defend myself against her vicious, unfounded accusations. But my expression turned ice cold and completely unbothered. I did not feel a single ounce of anger or residual hurt. I only felt a profound sense of clinical, peaceful detachment. I looked at the frantic, desperate woman who had birthed me and realized she was entirely hollow inside, operating purely on ego and delusion. I did not waste my breath arguing with her or trying to prove my innocence to a woman committed to misunderstanding me. I simply reached into my expensive clutch purse and pulled out my mobile phone. The sleek, dark device contrasted sharply with her frantic, messy energy. With a few swift taps on the screen, I bypassed the visual display and connected my device directly to the master sound system of the massive ballroom. I locked the audio controls to my personal device, ensuring that no one in the venue could stop what was about to happen. I looked at my mother and smiled, a cold, terrifying smile of absolute finality. I pressed play on this audio file I had saved exactly for this specific moment. The acoustic engineering of the grand ballroom was designed to amplify symphony orchestras and professional keynote speakers, providing crystal clear sound to every corner of the vast space. Instead, the premium speakers amplified the raw, unfiltered cruelty of my parents from the exact night they evicted me. The crisp, undeniable sound of the voice of Calvin boomed through the massive overhead speakers, filling every inch of the room with his harsh, arrogant tone. "Jada and Brad need this space," his recorded voice stated, echoing with terrible clarity over the silent crowd. "You just lost your job anyway, and you are 32 with no husband in sight. Figure it out." The wealthy guests froze completely in their tracks. The politicians who had just applauded his heartwarming speech about strong family values stared at the stage in absolute horror. But the recording was not finished exposing them. The shrill, demanding voice of Jada filled the room, screaming selfishly about her luxury car payments while her sister was packing her bags in the dark. And then the undeniable voice of Renee played at maximum volume for her entire country club to hear. "Your sister has a husband and a social standing to protect in this city." The recorded Renee scolded, her tone dripping with toxic elitism. "You are alone. You have no one depending on you and no image to uphold. For once in your life, put your jealousy aside and make a sacrifice for this family." The deep systemic hypocrisy of the perfect Christian family was laid completely bare for the entire city to hear and judge. The wealthy women from the church council, who had prayed for my supposed mental breakdown just a few days ago, covered their mouths in genuine shock and revulsion. They had been maliciously manipulated into feeling sorry for a mother who had actually thrown her own daughter out into the cold street just to fund a fake, fraudulent lifestyle for a white man. Disgust rippled through the audience like a physical wave, pushing them further away from the stage. People began shaking their heads, whispering openly about the sheer cruelty and the profound deception they had just witnessed firsthand. Renee slowly lowered her trembling finger, her face draining of all remaining color as the reality of her exposure set in. She looked out at her friends, her peers, and her lifelong social rivals. She saw the absolute contempt and judgment in their eyes. She realized in that exact moment that she would never be welcomed back into polite society ever again. Her prestigious reputation was permanently and irreversibly destroyed by the undeniable sound of her own voice. While the harsh echoes of the recording slowly faded into a heavy, suffocating silence, the general manager of the country club walked slowly and deliberately onto the stage. He carried a polished silver tray with a simple leather folder resting on top of it. He completely bypassed Renee, ignoring her existence, and walked directly over to Calvin, who was still standing over a bleeding, humiliated Brad. The manager cleared his throat, handing the leather folder directly to my father with a completely neutral expression. "Sir," the manager said politely but firmly, "the final bill for this evening requires immediate payment to the new ownership." Calvin opened the folder with shaking, sweaty hands. He stared at the total amount printed at the bottom of the invoice. $120,000 for the custom-imported orchids, the beluga caviar, the vintage champagne, and the extended venue hours they had so arrogantly demanded. Calvin had absolutely no money to his name. His retirement fund was completely gone. His credit cards were entirely maxed out, and his son-in-law was a documented fraud who was currently bleeding on the dance floor. Calvin slowly lifted his heavy head and looked directly at me. His eyes were wide and filled with a silent, desperate begging plea. He looked at me like a drowning man looking at a passing ship, wanting me to save him from his own massive failures one last time. He wanted me to cover the bill, just like I had always covered everything else. I walked slowly over to him, my designer heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor of the stage. I looked at the man who had packed my belongings into garbage bags without a second thought. I opened my designer clutch and reached inside, pulling out a single silver quarter. I reached out and held the coin directly over his empty champagne glass. I let go of the quarter and watched it drop. It landed at the bottom of the crystal glass with a sharp metallic clink that echoed perfectly into the microphone still resting on the podium. "Here is my contribution," I told him, my voice steady and completely empty of mercy. I turned around and walked down the steps of the stage, my private security team falling into formation right behind me. I walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, the wealthy guests parting respectfully to let me pass. I walked out of the heavy oak doors, leaving my completely ruined family behind, to drown in the beautiful, terrifying consequences of their own making. The ride back to the penthouse was the most peaceful journey of my entire life. I sat in the back of the luxury town car watching the bright city lights of Atlanta blur past the tinted windows. The heavy, suffocating weight of familial obligation had been completely lifted from my shoulders. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter forced to fund the delusions of arrogant people. I was finally just Simone. When I stepped into my penthouse suite, the silence of the massive space felt like a warm embrace. I walked over to the crystal decanter resting on the mahogany bar and poured myself a generous glass of expensive aged whiskey. The amber liquid burned slightly as it went down, grounding me in the reality of my absolute victory. I walked out onto the private balcony and let the cool night air wash over my skin as I looked down at the sprawling metropolis below. I knew exactly what was happening back at the Heritage Country Club. I knew the utter devastation and panic that was currently suffocating my parents and my sister. The social execution had been utterly flawless. My phone rested on the glass table next to me, vibrating continuously with an endless stream of incoming calls and text messages. The screen lit up brightly in the dark, displaying the names of the people who had tried to destroy me. Calvin called 6 times in a row. Rennie called immediately after him. Jada sent dozens of frantic text messages. My private security team had already forwarded me the transcripts of the voicemails they were leaving, so I would not have to actually listen to their voices. Calvin shifted between furious demands for me to return to the club to explain myself to the mayor, and pathetic begging for me to pay the catering bill because the club manager was threatening to call the police for theft of services. Renee left, sobbing messages, claiming that my actions were unchristian and that I needed to repent for humiliating my family in front of the entire church council. Jada left voice notes screaming that I had ruined her life and destroyed her perfect marriage by exposing the financial crimes of Brad. They were drowning in the chaotic aftermath of their own lies, and they still somehow expected me to throw them a life preserver. I picked up my phone and opened the voicemail application. I looked at the long list of desperate messages from my family. In the past, I would have listened to every single one, letting their toxic words infiltrate my mind and make me feel incredibly guilty for setting basic boundaries. But tonight, I felt absolutely nothing for them. I pressed the button to select all messages and then I hit delete. I completely erased their voices from my device without listening to a single second of their frantic pleading. I took a slow sip of my whiskey, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of liberation. The invisible chains that had bound me to their toxic demands were permanently broken. I was completely free to build a life surrounded only by people who actually valued my existence. The next morning, the warm Atlanta sun rose over a family that was completely ruined. The nightmare of the anniversary gala was only the beginning of their absolute destruction. My private investigator sent me a highly detailed report of the events that unfolded at the house while I was enjoying my morning coffee in the penthouse. Brad the Golden Boy, the brilliant, supposedly wealthy son-in-law, had completely vanished into thin air. After Calvin punched him on the dance floor, Brad managed to scramble out of the country club and take a rideshare back to the foreclosed mansion before anyone could stop him. He did not wait for Jada to come home to explain his actions. He threw his expensive tailored suits, his luxury watches, and whatever cash he could find in the safe into a single duffel bag and fled the state of Georgia in the middle of the night. He left his cell phone sitting on the kitchen counter to avoid being tracked by the highly dangerous men he owed money to. He even left his gold wedding band resting right next to the phone. Jada woke up the next morning with a bruised ego, a shattered social reputation, and an empty bed. But the true severity of the situation arrived just after breakfast. 2 dark, unmarked sedans pulled abruptly into the long, circular driveway of the house. 4 large men wearing cheap, aggressive suits marched up to the front door and began pounding heavily on the heavy wood. These were the loan sharks Brad had borrowed massive amounts of money from. They did not care about country club etiquette or polite society rules. They wanted their money, and they knew exactly where Brad lived and who his family was. Calvin opened the door, trying to use his usual arrogant authority to intimidate the men, but his elite status meant absolutely nothing to dangerous criminals collecting a substantial debt. They shoved their way into the grand foyer and demanded payment immediately. Calvin was forced to face the horrific reality of the forged documents I had displayed on the projector screens the night before. The men informed Calvin that since his signature was clearly written on the loan agreements, they were holding him personally responsible for the entire massive debt. They threatened to seize his vintage classic cars and drain whatever hidden retirement assets he had left if he did not produce the funds by the end of the week. Calvin called his lawyer in a state of absolute panic, hoping to find a legal loophole to save himself. The legal advice he received was incredibly simple and entirely devastating. The lawyer explained that the only way Calvin could avoid being legally and financially bound to the predatory loans was to go to the police and formally press criminal fraud charges against Brad. He had to officially declare that his son-in-law was a criminal who had forged his signature to steal money. But when Calvin looked at Jada, who was sobbing hysterically on the living room floor, begging her father not to send her beloved husband to federal prison, Calvin made his final fatal mistake. He could not bear to ruin the fake, perfect image of the marriage of his golden child. He was so deeply obsessed with what the community would think if his daughter became the wife of an incarcerated felon that he chose to protect the feelings of Jada over his own financial survival. He adamantly refused to press criminal charges against Brad. By refusing to turn Brad over to the authorities, Calvin legally accepted the massive fraudulent debt as his own personal responsibility. He officially signed his own financial death warrant just to maintain a pathetic illusion of family loyalty and high society prestige. The bank holding the primary mortgage on the Atlanta property moved with ruthless speed. Since I had formally withdrawn my financial backing and explicitly notified the bank of the unstable financial situation, the foreclosure process was significantly expedited. The massive unpaid property taxes, combined with the sudden default on the primary loan, triggered an immediate legal lockout. 3 days after the disastrous gala, local sheriffs arrived at the massive iron gates of the estate to officially enforce the eviction notice. Calvin tried to argue with the deputies, attempting to name-drop the mayor and the local police chief to buy himself more time. The sheriffs were completely apathetic to his former social status. They handed Calvin the court order and informed the family they had exactly 2 hours to gather their personal belongings and vacate the premises immediately, or they would be arrested for trespassing. Panic and absolute chaos consumed the house. My parents had absolutely no money left in their bank accounts to hire professional movers or secure a storage unit. Their credit cards were completely maxed out or frozen by the banking institutions. They had to frantically pack 35 years of accumulated wealth and precious memories using their own hands. They scrambled through the massive rooms, grabbing whatever clothing and jewelry they could carry. But they had no moving boxes and no time to acquire any. In a moment of brilliant poetic justice, they were forced to go into the kitchen pantry and pull out rolls of heavy-duty black garbage bags. Calvin, Renee, and Jada spent their final hours in that beautiful home, shoving their expensive designer clothes, their imported shoes, and their luxury handbags into cheap plastic trash bags. It was a direct, undeniable parallel to the exact same cruel actions they had inflicted upon me on the night I lost my corporate job. They had packed my entire life into trash bags without a second thought, and now the universe was forcing them to endure the exact same humiliating experience. Calvin dragged the heavy black garbage bags out to the front driveway, sweating profusely through his polo shirt and looking completely broken. Renee stood on the manicured lawn, holding a plastic bag full of cosmetics, crying uncontrollably as the neighbors from the surrounding mansions drove by and stared openly at their humiliating eviction. Women that Renee used to gossip about at the country club slowly drove their luxury cars past the driveway, watching the mighty family fall from grace in real time. Jada sat on the hard concrete curb next to a pile of trash bags, weeping over her ruined life and her missing husband, while clutching a bag of ruined silk dresses. They looked exactly like the pathetic, worthless failures they had constantly accused me of being. The sheriff stood by the front door, watching them drag their garbage bags down the driveway, before officially changing the locks and sealing the grand estate forever. They were completely homeless, bankrupt, and entirely disgraced in the eyes of the city they once ruled. Sitting on the curb with absolutely nowhere to go and no money to secure a hotel room, Renee became incredibly desperate. She refused to accept that her reign as a wealthy matriarch was permanently over. She pulled her mobile phone out of her pocket and decided to try one last pathetic attempt at manipulation. She did not try to call me because she knew I had blocked her number and would never answer. Instead, she sent a frantic, highly entitled email directly to the corporate address of my legal team. My private lawyer received the email and immediately forwarded it to my secure device while I was reviewing business contracts in my penthouse. I opened the message and read the delusional words of my mother. She demanded that my legal team provide her with the access codes and the physical keys to my historic beachfront estate in Oak Bluff's Martha's Vineyard. She typed that since it was technically a family property, she and Calvin had every legal and moral right to stay there during this temporary transition period. She ordered my lawyers to arrange a private flight for them to Massachusetts immediately so they could recover from their terrible week in peace, away from the judgmental eyes of Atlanta. She still truly believed that she possessed some kind of supreme authority over my assets and my life despite having treated me like absolute garbage for decades. She thought she could simply command me to hand over my sanctuary. I read the email and felt a cold, genuine smile form on my lips. The sheer magnitude of her entitlement was almost fascinating to observe. I called my lawyer and dictated the exact response I wanted him to send back to her. The reply did not contain any security access codes. It did not contain any digital keys or travel arrangements to my private island sanctuary. The email from my lawyer simply contained a specific date and a precise time for a final mandatory meeting. The location was set at the corporate headquarters of my massive cybersecurity firm right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The message stated that this would be the final opportunity for Calvin, Renee, and Jada to discuss the legal separation of all family ties. Their entire fake empire had been reduced to literal garbage bags sitting on a curb, and now they were going to have to walk into my empire and face the absolute final consequences of their profound cruelty. The end of their story was approaching incredibly fast, and I was ready to finish it entirely. The towering glass skyscraper of my cybersecurity firm pierced the clear blue morning sky of downtown Atlanta, like a permanent monument to everything my family had ever told me I could not achieve. The building was a modern fortress of steel and reflective glass projecting absolute authority over the very city my parents used to believe they ruled with their fake social status. I sat perfectly still at the head of a massive custom granite conference table in the primary executive boardroom, located on the 50th floor. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind me offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the sprawling metropolis, providing the perfect dramatic backdrop for the absolute final chapter of this miserable family saga. I was wearing a sharply tailored dark charcoal suit projecting the cold, sterile energy of a corporate executioner. My personal security detail stood silently by the double glass doors, waiting patiently for the final act to begin. I looked down at the thick legal portfolio resting on the table in front of me, knowing that the papers inside were going to sever the toxic bloodline forever. Down in the main lobby, my private investigators and the building security team were monitoring the arrival of my guests. My parents and my sister walked through the revolving glass doors, looking like mere shadows of the arrogant elite socialites they had been just a week ago. The security cameras captured every pathetic detail of their physical decline. Calvin was wearing a wrinkled suit that smelled faintly of a cheap motel room. His shoulders were slumped, and his usually polished leather shoes were heavily scuffed from dragging garbage bags down the driveway of his foreclosed mansion. Renee looked entirely washed out without her expensive salon treatments and her fake designer jewelry. Her eyes were puffy and red-rimmed from crying constantly over her destroyed reputation. Jada looked the absolute worst of them all. The golden child who had always prided herself on being the most beautiful and envied woman in any room was now completely disheveled. Her hair was messy and unstyled. Her face was devoid of the heavy contouring she usually wore, and she was clutching a cheap plastic shopping bag that likely contained her last few personal belongings. They looked exactly like the broken, bankrupt failures they truly were. The security guards escorted them into the private executive elevator, requiring special keycard access to reach the 50th floor. As they rode the elevator up to my boardroom, I knew exactly what was running through their delusional minds. Despite everything that had happened, despite the absolute public execution at the country club, and the ruthless eviction, they still fundamentally believed in the toxic dynamic that had governed our family for 3 decades. Calvin likely believed I had summoned them to this corporate fortress to show off my wealth one last time before offering him a lucrative position in my company. Renee probably convinced herself that I was finally ready to apologize for embarrassing her and that I was going to hand over the digital access codes to my historic beachfront estate in Martha's Vineyard. Jada undoubtedly expected me to write her a massive check to clear the debts her fraudulent white husband had left behind simply because she was my younger sister. They were expecting a dramatic reconciliation, a generous financial bailout, or at the very absolute minimum, a temporary place to live while they sorted out their ruined lives. They still deeply believed that I craved their approval and their validation. They had no idea they were walking into a legal slaughterhouse. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open, and the three of them stepped hesitantly into the massive space. They stopped near the entrance, completely intimidated by the sheer scale of the room and the intimidating view of the Atlanta skyline behind me. I did not stand up to greet them. I did not offer them coffee or sparkling water. I did not ask how they were holding up in their cheap motel room. I simply gestured to the three empty leather chairs positioned at the far opposite end of the long granite table, keeping as much physical distance between us as the room would allow. They walked over slowly and sat down, their eyes darting nervously around the immaculate boardroom, taking in the undeniable reality of the massive tech empire I had built in total secrecy. Calvin tried to adjust his wrinkled tie, attempting to summon some fragment of his old patriarchal authority. He opened his mouth to speak, preparing to deliver some manipulative speech about family bonds and overcoming hardships together. I did not let him say a single word. I placed my hand flat on the thick legal portfolio resting on the table and pushed it firmly. The heavy stack of documents slid smoothly across the polished granite surface, stopping perfectly right in front of my father. I kept my eyes locked directly on him, maintaining a cold, clinical gaze that offered absolutely zero warmth or mercy. "There is a pen inside the folder," I told them, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional fluctuation. "I expect all three of you to read the terms very carefully and sign on the designated lines." Calvin looked down at the folder, a flicker of greedy hope flashing across his tired face. He genuinely thought he was looking at a contract for a new house deed or a generous trust fund allocation. He opened the folder eagerly, his eyes scanning the first page of the dense legal text. But as he read the opening paragraphs, the desperate hope completely drained from his face, replaced by a profound, sickening realization. His hands began to tremble violently, and he dropped the document back onto the table as if it had physically burned him. Renee leaned over to look at the papers, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly as she tried to comprehend the complicated legal terminology. "What are you having us sign, Simone?" "It is not a bailout," I stated clearly, ensuring every word resonated in the quiet room. "It is a comprehensive legal separation document, terminating all financial, personal, and legal ties between myself and the three of you. It legally formally acknowledges that I owe you absolutely nothing. Furthermore, it contains an ironclad non-disclosure agreement in perpetuity. It legally forbids any of you from ever using my name, my likeness, or my corporate affiliations to secure loans, gain employment, or attempt to rebuild your destroyed social standing in the city of Atlanta. If you ever mention to anyone that you are related to the billionaire founder of this company, my legal team will sue you into a level of poverty you cannot even begin to imagine." The absolute finality of my words hung heavily in the sterile air of the boardroom. I was systematically erasing them from my existence and making it legally punishable for them to ever claim me as their blood. I was officially revoking their access to my identity, protecting the empire I had built from their parasitic greed. "If you sign these documents today," I continued, crossing my arms over my chest, "I will instruct my lawyers not to pursue you for the hundreds of thousands of dollars you allowed Brad to steal from my grandmother under the guise of fake business loans. I will let you walk out of this building without an active criminal fraud investigation hanging over your heads. But you will leave with exactly what you brought into this room, which is absolutely nothing. You will receive no money, no housing, and no forgiveness." Jada could not process the reality of the situation. The golden child who had spent her entire life being pampered and prioritized suddenly realized that there was no safety net left to catch her. The reality of returning to a cheap motel room with no luxury car and no wealthy husband broke her completely. She slammed her hands on the table and burst into loud, ugly tears, throwing a massive, childish tantrum right there in my corporate boardroom. "I am your sister!" she cried out, her voice shrill and desperate as tears streamed down her unwashed face. "You cannot do this to me, Simone. You cannot just abandon me like this. Brad took everything and left me with massive debts to terrible people. I have nothing left. You cannot let me live in a dirty motel while you sit up here in a glass tower. You have millions of dollars. You have a mansion on the beach. You have to help me. I looked at Jada, feeling completely emotionally detached from her pathetic sobbing. She was not crying because she felt remorse for her decades of cruelty or her blatant financial exploitation. She was only crying because the consequences of her own terrible choices were finally catching up to her. She still felt entirely entitled to the wealth she had mocked me for supposedly not having. I did not offer her a tissue or a single word of comfort. Rennie tried to use her favorite weapon of manipulation, shifting her strategy to religious guilt. She clutched her chest and looked at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, trying to play the role of the heartbroken, spiritually wounded mother. "Simone, please listen to your heart, Renee," pleaded her voice, trembling with manufactured sorrow. "God teaches us absolute forgiveness. The Bible tells us that we must care for our family members in their darkest times of need. We made mistakes, yes, but we are your parents. We gave you life. Blood is thicker than water, Simone. You cannot turn your back on your own flesh and blood when we are suffering so deeply." Her transparent attempt to use religion and biology to excuse her profound cruelty was almost laughable. The woman who had stood in the hallway of my house and told me to make a sacrifice so her white son-in-law could pretend to be a successful entrepreneur was now trying to lecture me about the sacred bonds of family. The mother who had eagerly packed my entire existence into black garbage bags without shedding a single tear was now demanding grace and mercy from the daughter she had gleefully thrown into the street. Calvin remained completely silent, staring blankly at the legal documents on the table. He finally understood that his authority was permanently gone. He had no leverage left to negotiate with and no power left to command. He picked up the expensive silver pen resting next to the folder and slowly signed his name on the dotted line, officially accepting the complete destruction of his family and the surrender of his dignity. Rennie wept as she signed her name beside his, realizing that her elite social life was permanently over. Jada signed the papers with shaking, sobbing hands, knowing she was returning to a life of complete retail poverty. I watched them sign away their rights to my existence, feeling a deep, overwhelming sense of closure. The traumatic chapter of my life that had been dominated by their constant belittling and their endless financial demands was officially over. They had handed over the documents confirming the absolute end of our relationship. I stood up slowly from my heavy granite chair. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, standing with my back to the brilliant Atlanta skyline. The sunlight caught the edges of my tailored suit, framing my silhouette in absolute dominant power. I looked down at the three broken people sitting at the far end of the table, people who had once been my entire world, but were now nothing more than strangers carrying my last name. "You love to quote that blood is thicker than water," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying finality. "But you completely forgot what that actually means. You traded my blood and my loyalty for the cheap lies of a white man and the lease on the luxury car. You chose to worship an illusion of prestige instead of protecting the daughter who was actually paying for the roof over your heads. You demanded that I sacrifice my stability so you could parade around in front of a community that is currently laughing at your eviction." I paused, letting the devastating truth of my words sink deeply into their minds. "The well is permanently dry," I told them, my eyes locked directly onto the tear-stained face of my mother. "There is no more money, there is no more patience, and there is absolutely no more family." I turned away from them and looked toward the heavy double doors of the boardroom. I gave a swift, decisive signal to my private security team, standing diligently in the hallway. The large men in dark suits stepped immediately into the room, moving with swift professional efficiency. They approached the table and instructed Calvin, Renee, and Jada to stand up and move toward the exit. My parents and my sister slowly gathered their cheap plastic bags and shuffled toward the door, looking completely empty and defeated. They did not look back at me as the security guards escorted them out of my executive boardroom. They walked out to the elevators, heading back down to the chaotic, unforgiving streets of a city they used to own. They were returning to their miserable motel room and their insurmountable debts, left alone to face the absolute brutal consequences of their own toxic choices. I stood alone in the quiet, expansive space of my corporate empire, looking out over the beautiful skyline of the city. The air in the room felt incredibly light and clean. The parasitic infection that had drained my energy for 32 years was completely removed from my system. I was finally entirely free. 6 months have passed since the day I escorted my family out of my corporate headquarters. The rapid collapse of their fake empire was a spectacular event to witness from a distance. I did not have to lift another finger to destroy them because they had already planted the seeds of their own absolute ruin. Brad, the golden boy who was supposed to build generational wealth for our family, did not stay hidden for very long. His desperate run from the dangerous loan sharks ended abruptly in a cheap motel parking lot down in sunny Florida. He was not caught by the criminals he owed money to, but by federal agents who had been tracking his extensive history of wire fraud and financial embezzlement across several state lines. My private investigators sent me the public mugshot, and I barely recognized the terrified, sweating man staring back at the camera. He is currently sitting in a federal holding facility, awaiting a lengthy trial with absolutely zero chance of making bail. The white savior my parents worshipped is going to spend the best years of his life wearing an orange jumpsuit locked inside a concrete cell. The legal consequences of the fraudulent loans of Brad fell entirely onto the shoulders of Calvin, just as my lawyers predicted. Because Calvin adamantly refused to press criminal charges against his beloved son-in-law to protect the fragile feelings of Jada. He was held personally and entirely responsible for the massive predatory debt. The loan sharks and the aggressive collection agencies drained every single remaining cent from his accounts. Today, the man who used to stand at the podium of the Heritage Country Club, bragging about his elite social status and his brilliant business acumen, is working as a full-time greeter at a massive chain hardware store on the outskirts of Atlanta. He stands by the sliding automatic doors for 8 agonizing hours a day, wearing a cheap bright orange vest over his tired shoulders, handing out shopping carts to local contractors. His feet swell. His back aches, and every single meager paycheck he earns is immediately garnished by aggressive debt collectors. He has to smile and welcome the very same wealthy men he used to play golf with, hiding his immense shame behind a forced, pathetic grin. Renee suffered a fate that was arguably much worse for a woman whose entire existence was built on social climbing and public validation. The humiliating audio recording I played at the anniversary gala spread through the elite circles of Atlanta society like a highly contagious virus. The wealthy women she used to gossip with, the influential wives of local politicians, and the judgmental members of the church council completely excommunicated her from their community. She was formally and permanently banned from the Heritage Country Club and every other exclusive organization in the city. Her name became a toxic punchline, a cautionary tale of spectacular maternal failure and overwhelming greed. She now lives in a tiny, cramped apartment in a loud, undesirable neighborhood, completely isolated and entirely alone. She spends her miserable days scrolling mindlessly through social media, looking at the glamorous events she is no longer invited to attending. She has no friends left to impress and absolutely no money left to spend. The heavy silence of her lonely apartment is the only reward she received for 32 years of extreme narcissism. But the most tragic and poetic downfall belongs entirely to Jada. The former beauty queen, the pampered golden child, who firmly believed the entire universe revolved around her designer wardrobe, was violently forced into the harsh, unforgiving reality of the working class. Without my money to fund her luxury car leases, and without the fake wealth of Brad to support her illusions, Jada had to actually find a job to survive. She currently works at a brightly lit perfume counter in the middle of a loud, crowded shopping mall. She spends her long, exhausting shifts standing on her feet, spraying cheap fragrance samples onto small pieces of cardboard for rude, impatient customers. The immense stress of deep poverty and the lingering trauma of the absolute betrayal of her husband have severely aged her once flawless face. The heavy, expensive makeup she tries to wear can no longer hide the dark, exhausted circles under her eyes or the deep, bitter lines forming around her mouth. She is forced to watch wealthy, successful Black women walk past her counter every single day, wearing the exact same designer brands she used to arrogantly flaunt. She has to smile and offer them a fragrance sample, knowing she will never again belong to their world. She lost her house, her car, her husband, and her fake superiority, all because she demanded that I sacrifice my life for hers. They are all drowning in the miserable permanent consequences of their own toxic choices. While they serve their bitter sentences in Atlanta, I am sitting comfortably on the expansive wooden deck of my historic beachfront estate in Oak Bluffs. The warm summer sun is shining brightly over Martha's Vineyard, casting a beautiful, sparkling glow across the gentle waves of the Atlantic Ocean. The salty breeze carries the joyful sound of genuine laughter and brilliant conversation from the backyard lawn behind me. I am not sitting here alone in isolation. The sprawling grounds of my multi-million-dollar sanctuary are currently filled with dozens of young, incredibly talented African American women. They are software engineers, data scientists, application developers, and cybersecurity experts. I decided to host a massive summer retreat, an exclusive networking and mentorship gathering specifically designed for brilliant Black women in the technology sector. I watched them mingle on the manicured grass, holding crystal glasses of sparkling water and sharing their innovative ideas with one another. They are building revolutionary algorithms, discussing complex coding languages, and forming deep collaborative partnerships. I am providing them with the exact kind of vital mentorship, genuine encouragement, and substantial financial funding that I absolutely never received from my own biological family. My corporate holding company has established a massive venture capital fund entirely dedicated to supporting minority women who want to build their own independent tech empires. I walk among them listening to their passionate pitches and writing massive checks to fund their brilliant startup companies. I am actively using my immense wealth to elevate women who actually deserve to be elevated women, who work tirelessly and possess genuine raw talent instead of relying on fake social prestige. The energy on my estate today is vibrant, powerful, and completely authentic. There is no toxic competition, no petty jealousy, and absolutely no one demanding unearned sacrifices. We are a community built on mutual respect and shared ambition. As I look at the glowing, inspired faces of these incredible women, I realize that I have successfully built my own chosen family. I did not need the toxic bloodline of my parents or the parasitic attachment of my sister to feel a sense of belonging in this world. I created a beautiful, thriving ecosystem of support and excellence right here on my own property. I am surrounded by brilliant, resilient sisters who push me to be a better leader and a better woman. The heavy, painful void left behind by the absolute betrayal of Calvin and Renee has been completely filled with purpose and profound joy. I took the deep, agonizing wounds they inflicted upon me and transformed them into an unshakable foundation for a massive legacy of empowerment. I am no longer just a survivor of family abuse. I am the architect of a completely new reality where women who look like me can thrive without ever having to compromise their dignity or their peace. As the vibrant summer gathering slowly winds down and my brilliant guests begin to depart for the evening, I take a quiet, solitary walk along my private stretch of the beach. The sun is beginning its slow, colorful descent toward the distant ocean horizon, painting the vast evening sky in breathtaking strokes of deep purple and vibrant, fiery orange. The cool, wet sand sinks softly beneath my bare feet, and the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves provides a peaceful, steady soundtrack to my thoughts. I look out at the endless expanse of the dark blue water, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute clarity settling deep into my bones. True power, I realize in this beautiful, quiet moment, is not just about accumulating massive amounts of money or acquiring exclusive real estate portfolios. Financial wealth gave me the necessary resources to escape the suffocating trap my family built for me, but the money itself did not heal me. True absolute power is waking up one day and finally realizing that the people who tied you down and demanded your constant sacrifice never actually deserved your precious loyalty in the first place. It is the painful but liberating understanding that just because someone shares your biological DNA does not automatically grant them endless access to your energy, your resources, or your life. For 32 long, agonizing years, I operated under the deeply flawed assumption that it was my fundamental duty to absorb the cruelty of my parents and financially support the delusions of my sister. I believed that if I just worked hard enough and gave them enough money, they would eventually see my worth and love me the way they loved Jada and her fraudulent husband. But standing here on this beautiful beach, completely free of their heavy, toxic expectations, I finally understand the absolute truth about boundaries and grace. Forgiveness is a beautiful, sacred gift, but it is strictly reserved for those who actually possess the humility to ask for it and the genuine desire to change their harmful behavior. Boundaries, however, are the absolute heavy armor we must wear to protect ourselves from the people who refuse to do either. My family never wanted my forgiveness because they never fundamentally believed they were doing anything wrong. They only wanted my submission and my endless financial compliance. By walking away from their abusive demands and refusing to save them from their own catastrophic mistakes, I did not commit an act of cruelty. I committed a radical, necessary act of profound self-love. I chose to save myself instead of drowning with them. I stop walking and stand perfectly still at the edge of the water, letting the cool ocean breeze blow freely through my hair. The very last golden rays of the setting sun wash over my face, illuminating a woman who has completely reclaimed her entire narrative. I look directly forward, feeling more grounded and more powerful than I ever have in my entire existence. I want to ask you a very important question as you listen to the conclusion of my long journey. Have you ever woken up and realized that the specific people aggressively demanding your absolute loyalty are the exact same ones who sold their own loyalty for absolutely free? Have you ever realized that the family members calling you selfish are just deeply angry that they can no longer use you to fund their own reckless mistakes? If you have ever had to walk away from toxic bloodlines to protect your own sacred peace, please let me know your story in the comment section below. Hit the like button and subscribe to this channel if you truly believe in the absolute power of setting unapologetic boundaries and reclaiming your self-worth. And please always remember one very important lesson when dealing with parasitic people. Sometimes the most devastating, beautiful, and satisfying revenge you can ever achieve is simply stepping aside and letting them live permanently with the brutal, severe consequences of their own miserable choices.